Calendars. All right, so without further ado, I will now turn the table to Magali.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to introduce Katharina Piechocki, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Comparative Literature at Harvard, where she specializes in European Renaissance and Baroque literature as well as world cinema. She holds a PhD in Romance languages, Romance studies from the University of Vienna, and another PhD in comparative literature from New York University. She's published in a wide variety of venues in Europe as well as the US in German, English, Italian, and French, putting all of us soundly to shame, and is currently at work on 2 book projects. So the first, Cartographic Humanism, Defining Early Modern Europe, 1480 to 1580, is the topic of her talk today, in which she investigates the interstices between the West and non-West, the boundaries of early modernity, and the borders of early modern Europe. She'll also be working on a second book project titled Procreations, The Rise of the Opera Libretto in Early Modern Europe, 1600 to 1700, in spring 2017 as a research fellow at the IFK in Vienna, Austria. And this précis is, of course, impressive, and certainly as a grad student with Katharina at NYU, I spent several weeks convinced I'd made a mistake by going to graduate school without already having gone to graduate school. But what this list points to, and it's been the pleasure of knowing Katharina for several years, is her real engagement with that central motor of comparative literature, which is the movement toward breadth while maintaining that sort of expertise and depth in those topics as you move outward. And that's the kind of thing that both remakes literary critical categories within our various subfields, but also is a real argument for, I think, the worth of comparative literature and the role of that kind of humanistic inquiry more broadly. Her presentation today is an overarching presentation from that first book, and I hope you'll get a sense of just how exciting her book is.
Thank you very much, Jonathan and Magali, for the invitation. Magali, for this most humbling introduction, really. I think I should just walk out in shame. And it's been a pleasure to be here, and I look tremendously forward to talking to you. It's rare that I have an opportunity to talk to a complete crowd, and I look very, very much forward to your feedback. And as Magali said, this presentation is part of my ongoing book project, which is on the intersection, really, among cartography, poetics, and translation. And I use that to think about Europe's boundaries around 1500. So most of my chapters are situated around 1500. And I apologize for those of you who had a look at my previous title. I had to drop Poland. I did so because I thought I have to provide you with a sort of theoretical background for my work. And I have half an hour, so it would not have been possible to do 3 countries. But I will talk about 2 authors: a German humanist, Konrad Celtis, and a French writer and humanist, Geoffroy Tory. And you will not get a glimpse, really, a broader glimpse into their work and into the breadth, really, of their work, but rather just some specific topics that are relevant for my topic. So, why cartography? In his recent work on the rise of the concept of metrical space in early modern Europe, La crisi della ragione cartografica, Franco Farinelli argues that the advent of early modernity is defined by its new approach to space. Early modernity, just like modernity, is, as Heidegger memorably put it, the epoch of the world image, in which the world started being experienced not immediately, but through the mediating interface and powerful presence of the flat surface of the 2-dimensional image, i.e. the map. Earlier maps, such as the medieval Mappa Mundi, reflected the fullness of human life, from religious preoccupations to everyday activities, as we can see on this 13th century Ebsdorf map. Here, aspects of everyday life are articulated and integrated alongside the overarching framework of Christianity. We see Jesus's head, but also his hands and his feet really embracing the known world. The medieval map functions, Farinelli claims, as a reflection of the world and its specific symbolism. In contrast, the early modern map is exactly the opposite. It no longer functions as a reflection of the world. Contrary to the medieval map, the early modern map is characterized by a different approach to space. Here, the world is experienced as a copy of the map that now dictates the shape of the world. We see here, for instance, a mountain range shaped to fit the frame of the map. The defining moment that triggered a different approach to space was the introduction in Europe and the translation from the Greek into the Latin of Ptolemy's geography. Ptolemy's second, so here we have a 1535 edition of Ptolemy. Ptolemy's 2nd century Common Era geography, rediscovered and reintroduced in Western Europe in the first half of the 15th century, significantly challenged and altered previous spatial models. The geography became, as James Hankins has argued, I quote, in the early 15th century, a focal point for that rich network of cultural movements we've referred to as the Renaissance, end of quote. A productive trigger for the emergence of humanistic disciplines, Ptolemy's geography was brought to Italy from Byzantium by Manuel Chrysoloras, together with world maps, as we can see here. You see Africa is, of course, not yet fully mapped. The Indian Ocean is not mapped either, and the Indian Ocean in Ptolemy's geography was conceived as an enclosed ocean. And a set of rectangular regional maps, the so-called tabulae, produced in Byzantium during the Middle Ages. The world maps and the regional tabulae were created according to two different projections, and here we see, actually, this is the second, so-called second projection. This would be the first conic projection. The new Ptolemaic maps introduced an important novelty: longitudinal and latitudinal lines. This new method of projection redirected early modern spatial thinking in that it allowed to reduce the three-dimensional globe to a two-dimensional surface. While, of course, also the medieval map technically shows a three-dimensional world on a two-dimensional surface, the novelty of the Ptolemaic map is that it claimed to offer, for the first time, a model to grid space mathematically with the help of longitudinal and latitudinal lines. Reverting the term space to its Latin adaman, spatium, and the Greek stadion, Farinelli defines space in the spirit of Ptolemy as a quantifiable linear standard interval between two geometrical points. Reduced to metrics and Euclidean geometry, the space projected onto the rectangular map, according to Ptolemy's methods, became the point of departure and the foundation for Renaissance humanists to perceive, survey, and imagine territories, not only on maps, but also in literary texts. The geography offered Europeans for the first time a tool to produce maps in a scientific, mathematical way and to reckon metrical space through the unprecedented use of scales. Ptolemaic maps transformed an unruly landscape and natural boundaries, as we've seen with the case of the mountain chain, into simple geometric figures that were fitted into and sometimes corresponded with the frame of the map. The Ptolemaic map transforms a three-dimensional world into a surface, literally into the face of the earth. According to Farinelli, it is difficult to find a more compelling factor that would set the medieval period apart from early modernity than the reduction precisely of the three-dimensional world to the two-dimensional metrical grid system. Early modernity is thus characterized by the rise of the surface, hence my title, upon which the image of the world is displayed and arranged to fit the frame. This new spatial imagery is inscribed in early modern literary and historical texts. I will focus on two authors, or as Tom Conley would say, cartographic writers, whose work unearths the manifold articulations of space and in language and on woodcuts that accompany their works. The cartographic writers I wish to consider today operate within Ptolemy's concept of a gridded space and mind. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of their work is that they imagine in word and image the very process of the reduction of the three-dimensional world into the two-dimensional surface. In other words, they trace the very operation of a Ptolemaic cartographic projection. Let me illustrate this by turning my attention to our first example. German humanist Konrad Celtis, the first poet laureate outside of Italy, whose interests were in poetry, versification, and cartography alike. He was actually called the poet cosmographer, and whose Quatuor Libri Amorum, Secundum Quatuor Latera Germaniae from 1902, i.e. the four books of love according to or following the four sides of Germany, a book of elegies, can be considered a cartographic book par excellence. Not only does it give precedence to cartography in the title, indeed poetry follows or is second to cartography, but it also traces the very cartographic operation of spatial projection, or as I said, the reduction of the three-dimensional world into a two-dimensional surface. Let me start, though, with an early passage in Ptolemy's Geography, where Ptolemy introduces his fundamental distinction between cosmography and chorography, the former being the description of the world, which Renaissance humanists often referred to as geography, so cosmography equals geography, and the latter being the description of a region or of a particular locale. Indeed, Ptolemy uses the analogy of the human body. For him, cosmography corresponds to the head, while chorography is metonymically the ear or the eye. Yet the relationship between these terms is not only one of a three-dimensional living body into which it's two-dimensional. Sorry, I think I skipped a page. Yet the relationship between these terms is not only one of scale, proportion, measurement, but also one of quality. Their goals differ. As a pars pro toto, chorography is an independent discipline, as Ptolemy repeatedly emphasizes. On the other hand, cosmography glosses over regional nuances and focuses on the connectivity of bodily members. I have a quote here. I won't read it, though. It is partial in grasping, so chorography is partial in grasping details, but total in its, so cosmography is partial in grasping detail, but total in its capacity to create a pattern. Most importantly, as Ptolemy hastens to add, the cosmographer needs to make sure to have a large enough surface to display and arrange the bodily members into a meaningful and orderly pattern. The specific moment in which the cosmographer arranges the members explicitly compared to the human body on a flat surface is the very moment of the transition of the unruly three-dimensional body, whose living limbs are at first ungraspable and immeasurable, to a measured two-dimensional alignment of members. It is only once these members are stretched out on the surface that they become measurable. And Franco Farinelli illustrates the specific transitory moment which emphasizes the presence of the very tabula as a necessary basis for early modern spatial thinking in the reading of the myth of Apollo and Dionysus, as well as in the Vita of St. George, Both stories have in common the centrality of an unruly body of Dionysus and the dragon, respectively, which is subdued by a stronger orderly force, Apollo and St. George. The living and meandering body, ungraspable and incommensurate at first, becomes tamed and measurable as a dead body, and only as a dead body, as it extends across the flat surface of the table. Farinelli points out that according to several Greek myths, it is Dionysus' brother Apollo, the god of measurement and containment, who, following Zeus's will, recomposes his brother's dead body. However, Farinelli continues, most versions of the myth neglect to mention the most important detail. In order to recompose Dionysus' body, Apollo has to display it on a surface big enough to hold and contain his brother's members. This surface is the tabula, a crucial support that allows the composition of bodily parts to happen in the first place. The surface becomes the first altar that, just like every other cartographic representation, uses only two out of its dimensions, its length and width, and becomes of greatest use when it is as flat as possible. Apollos' story captures the very moment of the transformation of the three-dimensional living body into its two-dimensional extension as an assemblage and alignment of measured units. In Farinelli's spatial reading, only in a state of absolute motionless can bodily members be assembled to form a measured surface. Only as dead members can bodily limbs themselves become units and instruments of measurement, such as hands, arms, braccia in Italian, or feet, our standard unit of measurement. It is through the very figure of Apollo, the god of measurement and order, that this specific transitional moment, foundational for the generative foundational for and generative of spatial and poetic thinking, that is of measured discourse, is encapsulated in Celticis Quatuor Libri Amorum. On a woodcut contained in Celticis' book of poems, the author is shown at work in his studiolo, framed by the ancient gods Minerva, Mercury, Hercules, Venus, Apollo, and Bacchus. And I want to point your attention to Apollo. The most important god here is Apollo. It is the god with whom Celtis identified himself most. Here, Apollo is named Phoebus the Radiant, standing firmly on the surface of the earth. His bow and arrow point toward the ground. Apollos' head is framed by a halo-like glow emitting rays. Behind his back is strapped a harp-shaped lyre, and his quiver, whose strings and arrows respectively seem to emanate ray-like from Apollos' body. Yet his pose and manner in which Apollo holds his bow and arrow are reminiscent of medieval and early modern iconographic representations of geometers holding a compass. Here, for instance, we see a 13th century illumination representing God as a geometer holding a compass in his hand and measuring the sphere, quite like Apollo in Celtis' woodcut, where the point of projection even coincides with Apollo's eye. Perhaps the most intriguing element in Celtis' depiction of Apollo is the presence of the winding body of a python next to Apollos' right leg, and I have a close-up of that. Pierced by Apollos' vertical arrow, the meandering body of the python lies transfixed on the ground. Reminiscent of the depiction of St. George slaying the dragon, Apollo is highlighted here as the defeater of the python's bloated body. In the woodcut, then, Apollos' oversized measuring instrument, the compass in the shape of bow and arrow, as well as his defeat of the python's three-dimensional threat, turn the radiant god into the generator of a flat horizontal space. Apollo epitomizes what Farinelli called the advent of a unique territorial syntax, a tabula rasa. And the Homeric hymn to Apollo and of its metamorphoses tells the story of Apollos' destruction of the python and the terror it created. And unfortunately, I don't have the time to read that, but here you have the story that is depicted on the woodcut in Celtis' book of poems, where Ovid talks about the space that is created once the mountain-shaped monster is destroyed. Here the python stands for the immeasurable and unpredictable, for the innumerable forms of life that earth can bring forth. In Ovid's lines, the monstrous python is so immense that it is likened to the space of a mountain. Apollo turns the coiling snake into a dead tabula. Once the coiling monster has been defeated and flattened, the terror that emanates from the python is transformed into territory. And we have actually in a few Roman geometrical writers the etymology, the etymological proximity between territory and terror. It's a false etymology, but it was held true for some Roman writers. Apollo, the god of measurement, and Celtis's alter ego, sets the stage for the creation of a metrically informed cartographic poetics and the measurement and definition of Germany as a gridded surface. And I can't get into that, of course, today. You have to believe me. My second example leads me to France and the work of Geoffroy Théry, whose Champs Fleuris, Flowery Field, was published in 1529. It is a book about the spatialization and gridding of all the letters of the alphabet. A process which Théry conflates with the process of map making. Théry arranges and orients his letters with the Ptolemaic tabula in mind. While Book 3 follows an alphabetical order, in Book 2, Théry places the letters, I quote, not in their alphabetical order, but wittingly, mingled together in such wise that they make a very beautiful and perfect work, which is called in Latin opus vermiculatum, opus tessellatum, and assatorum. So basically a chessboard, a mosaic, whereof Pliny in his Natural History and Vitruvius in his Book of Architecture speak amply, end of quote. Théry's mosaic-like square, upon which are cast three-dimensional figures on a flat plane, evokes, on the one hand, a medieval mappa mundi. Basically, we have here sort of Christ-like Vitruvian man. It's not quite clear. It's really kind of very interesting transitional moment on the one hand, and on the other, a chessboard of two contrasting colors arranged as a battlefield between two even chronomatically differentiated parties. Chess encapsulates the strategic overlap propagated by the image of the Vitruvian man between the shape of the letter and the three-dimensional figure positioned on the battlefield. Just like chess figures, I quote, the letters which are made on the pattern of the human body, Théry contends, quote, stand in their requisite and proper aspect, upright and intact, end of quote. Oscillating between verticality and horizontality, the image of the chess players positioned on a square field emphasizes the operatic moments as well as the resistance to the reduction of a three-dimensional living world to the two-dimensional surface. The flat surface of the page, the geometrically designed flowery field upon which Théry casts geometrically standardized letters, Tom Conley contends, I quote, can be gridded, fashioned into prototypes of pixels, coordinated, graphed, and even navigated, end of quote. The pixel as a point, a marker of an unfolding extension, allows for the page to emerge as a standardized square upon which, I quote, reading the text is tantamount to a mensuration of words. That's Conley's words, that is, of imagining them as equally sized units like pixels that are seen in a serial and discrete configuration, end of quote. Théry's pixelation of the page calls for the development of an apparatus of analysis that will map the ways readers and spectators can orient themselves, and indeed, Théry orients the letters. We have Orient, Occident, South, Midi, Septentrion, so it's basically the north and south. He imagines his letters really like on a map. The well-defined surface of a measured page allows for the creation of what David Woodward has termed an equipolant coordinate space, which is entirely geometrical and abstract, independent of the geographical content beneath, attributing the same value to each point plotted by longitudes and latitudes. I quote, "The graduated grid is the site or the arena where the essay, the exercise, or even the military operation takes place," end of quote. In the midst of the standardized arena, Torrey leaves a small white square, which is the unit of the said letter I, and which I call the unit of each letter, saying this letter or that letter, so that many units of height, so to say, many units of height and so many of breadth. Following Vitruvius, the standard measurement for the letter I, Torrey considers, is 11 points, thus 10 units. Torrey establishes the number 10 as the perfect number and as the standardized unit for the grid. It is no coincidence that the perfect number 10 is shaped like the two letters that Torrey considers to be the basis of the entire Latin alphabet, I and O. And for Torrey, these two letters are the basis. You can create all the letters you want, just starting with these two. And we have also Apollo here as the guide of muses. Torrey embarks on an exploration of the origin of these two letters and introduces the story of the mortal nymph Io, E-O, loosely grounding his fable in Book 1 of Ovid's Metamorphoses. It will not come as a surprise that in the myth of Io, the origin of the letters coincides with the act of naming and measuring territories. Just a few sentences about the story. Jupiter, enamored of King Inachus's daughter Io, invented a subterfuge to escape his wife and sister Juno's ire by changing Io into a cow. Juno noticed Jupiter's ruse and asked her husband to give her Io as a gift. Once her demand was granted, Juno gave Io in charge to her shepherd Argus, who had in his face and all over his head 100 eyes. It's a very kind of cartographic image. Which never slept at all at the same time, but two by two, while the others kept watch. Perfect surveillance instrument, the head of Argus. Argus mistreated Io by beating her and throwing stones at her head and tail and legs. Unable to speak, Io suffered until finally Jupiter changed his messenger Mercury into the form of a shepherd, keeping kids and lambs, and sent him to Argus, who was tormenting the said cow among the fields and valleys. Mercury started playing most melodiously on his pipes, so that Argus called to him to come and rest on the grass beside him, where he lay at full length in the shade of a cliff. Moved by Mercury's music, Argus fell asleep so deeply that all his eyes, which were, as has been said, 100 in number, fell asleep at once. Whereupon Mercury took his shepherd's knife and cut his head off. Io, finally liberated, set out on her journey home. Torrey continues until she came to a place where her father Inachus had been changed into a river god, otherwise called a sea god. This Inachus, knowing not of his daughter's unfortunate plight and thinking that she was in truth a cow, offered her handfuls of tender and sweet-smelling grasses and petted her affectionately, touching her with his divine hands on brow and back and flanks, until as he went and came about her, he saw his daughter's name written in the place where the beautiful cow's foot had pressed the earth. The name of the two letters only, I and O, basically the hoof, the imprint of the hoof, from which the name of the country was called Ionia and its people Ionians. The story of Therese Yeo calls attention to the intricate relation that binds the emergence of a new alphabet to the surveying of land and the creation of a new territory. Yeo, the creator of a new alphabet, endowed with the capacity to speak and name, becomes simultaneously the first geometer and surveyor of a hitherto incommensurate land, the liminal space of Ionia that constitutes the boundary between Europe and Asia. Once Argus's monstrous globe-shaped head is cut off, Yeo is capable of tracing letters in the ground, finding her speech, and naming her land and its people. So to conclude, in a book titled Blinding Polyphemus, Geography and the Models of the World, Franco Farinelli, again, suggests that the birth of cartography and map-making and the rise of the early modern surface takes its origin precisely with the killing of a globe-shaped monster, Polyphemus. Odysseus' blinding of Polyphemus is the archetypical act of transforming a three-dimensional, incommensurable world into a flat surface that can be measured and defined. The one-eyed Polyphemus, Farinelli argues, is the monster of illogical thought. Polyphemus's world, I quote, coincides with the globe, with the enormous and heavy boulder which bars the entrance to the cave and prevents the Greeks from returning to liberty. When they finally manage to return to light, nothing will be as it used to be. Between them and the world, there will be something that did not exist before, the flat earth. As a horizontal extension. The difference between entering and exiting the cave, Farinelli continues, is that the boulder has been removed, the monstrous mountain-shaped Polyphemus has been slain. His body now lies extended on the ground. The Greeks have transformed the three-dimensional globe into its two-dimensional representation that, once flattened and extended on the surface of the earth, can be measured, surveyed, and named. When Therese Mercury decapitates the multi-eyed Argus and Celtis's Apollo slays the bloated, unruly body of the Python, they perform an act analogous to Odysseus' slaying of Polyphemus. The flat surface, the very ground upon which Yeo imprints the two letters of the alphabet and her name, and upon which the lifeless and thus measurable body of Apollos' Python is extended, serves as the ground upon which the limits of territories, peoples, and languages can be drawn. Yeo is thus able to trace her name on the Earth's surface. Apollo is capable of truly becoming the god of measurement. Through this reductive and transformative process, the Earth becomes measurable, and its people, countries, and languages can at once be named. Yeo imprints lines, like the letter I, upon the surface of the Earth, like a cartographer who draws latitudes and longitudes on a Ptolemaic map. By structuring and measuring hitherto incommensurable land, Yeo, just like Apollo, transforms the three-dimensional world into its own two-dimensional model. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your talk. I really find it fascinating how this act of mortal reduction, or this allegorized mortal reduction of the two-dimension isn't actually a reduction. It's actually a very rich technological form. And I'd just like to lead things off with a really kind of wild, speculative question, which is to think about the ways in which you might have a narrative for deducing other dimensions from this. I was thinking of in the Ptolemaic map how substratum is off to the side, off to the margins, and all the other elements on one hand of
Which one?
on the Ptolemaic. There we go. The subsol. Sorry, right. Sort of the other sort of elements of the cosmos,
Yes.
right, are on the boundaries of this map, and yet there's one other extrapolation from the grid is there's the microcosm and the macrocosm on one hand, and the other you have the development of perspective. And I'm wondering if you have a kind of a narrative for those two technologies as derivations of the grid.
Well, it's a very tricky question that art historians, luckily not myself, are dealing with as we speak. So there are two different ways of thinking about the development of perspective in Florence exactly at the same time with Brunelleschi, Alberti, and so on and so forth, and the discovery of Ptolemy's geography exactly in Florence at the same time, and its translation from the Greek into the Latin, and subsequently also into different vernaculars. And the question is, of course, what came first? Did Ptolemy influence Brunelleschi and Alberti and the perspective, the perspectival projection in painting, or is it rather the other way around, where we had already Brunelleschi and Alberti thinking about perspective, and it so happened that the discovery of Ptolemy was just added. And it is still a very hot debate among art historians. I, of course, like to think that, as you can imagine, that Ptolemy's rediscovery in Europe had something to do with the development of the perspective in painting, but it's nothing that has been proven. And Farinelli thinks that. Farinelli thinks that Alberti and Brunelleschi were influenced precisely by those maps that were brought to Florence at exactly that time. Actually, at the end, in 1397, for the first time, they were already there, and people were starting working on the translation. So it's still an open question, I like to think that Ptolemy had something to do with it.
And time for questions.
Thanks. You started off with a quote from Farinelli, if I'm not mistaken, that mentioned metrics. And first I thought it had to do with literary metrics, poetic metrics, right? But it's interesting to me that this early modern period is a time of that's interesting when you look at metrics, because Latin, the transition from Latin to vernaculars is accelerating. I won't say just happened, it's accelerating, and so the decentering from one language, Latin, to all these European languages, at least in Europe, is happening. At the same time, if I'm not mistaken, medieval maps had always a center, whether it was Jerusalem or the face of Christ, as we saw. And now we're also getting, with Ptolemaic projections, a decentering, right? A different kind of borders, right? Different kind of projection. And you also mentioned, right, the two books, the German writing of the four sides of the Earth. I thought I saw a center there, like
Yes,
Bohemia
that's
Albis,
very good,
right?
absolutely,
And
yes.
also the French writing about the letters. In one part of the book, he has them center, right? Alpha and Omega, in alphabetical terms. But the other part of the book, again, the center is lost. He if I'm not mistaken, makes a random ordering, right? So my question, based on all these examples, would you say that there's, at this period of time, a decentering, a sort of new thinking about decentering, whether it's leaving Latin as the center of languages and literatures and going into vernaculars, that has its, also then reflects on metrics, and also in map making. So is there a decentering and new thinking about what center presents and what is decentering? That's my question.
That's a fabulous question, and thank you for just having written my introduction. It is absolutely the case that that there is an overlap in models and spatial models that you see in both Celtis and in Geoffroy Tory. And you're absolutely right. This goes back to a Mappa Mundi, like we see here, where Jerusalem is still the center. We don't see it very well, but Jerusalem is still the center here. And this model is taken over. And this, by the way, this map is oriented to the east. We see Asia in the east, and of course the Garden of Eden, from which the four rivers flow here in the east. And in Celtis we have Bohemia, and this is with the kind of Hercynian forest that surrounds and haunts writers such as Shakespeare until the 17th century, really, around Bohemia. And Bohemia was I don't have the map here, but Bohemia on several European maps appears as the center. There is a map from 1500 and 1501 by Erhard Etzlaub, who has Bohemia as the center of Europe. This map is centered to the south. We have Meridias, where we usually have north, which reminds us that having the north on top is a convention. There's nothing natural about that. This is the Arab tradition of map making, to have the south face where we now have the north. And this is absolutely a model still imbued in the medieval mappamundi. Absolutely, where we have a center. And David Woodward would call that a center enhancing map. So the mappamundi would be the center enhancing map. While a map like this is an equivalent map that gets rid of centers, and it's an entirely decentralized map. Now, your question is excellent about how does that relate to languages and metrics. And Konrad Zelti's, the first book he wrote is a treatise on metrics and versification, and he got he was crowned poet laureate precisely for having written that book. And he wrote only in Latin, while he said that we have to promote our own German language. So there is a kind of contradiction inscribed in that very book. It's about bringing in humanism into Germany, but you do it in this still center-enhancing way with Latin metrics. It's a great question, and absolutely, both models are here overlapped. And I could give you a lot of examples, and the same is true for Geoffroy Tory, with the Vitruvian man that is at the same time very close to the Ebsdorf map, with even the navel being the center of the world. And there's a big also play with the navel as the origin of the human being, and as the origin and the center of this medieval mappamundi. Thank you. Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question that goes, I think, toward, it's also an invitation to talking a little bit more about the temporal frame, 1480 to 1580. But for me, as someone who's a sort of a vulgar modernist, let's say, right? So I come to the early modern period and think about its continuity with questions I'm thinking about now. Your talk, and in particular your use of the verbs, both as metaphors and literally the verbs you're talking about, these processes, invite me to then make the claim, right? This is the beginning of the perfection of a particular kind of machinery of empire, this technology of metrics, reduction, and so on, that lends itself so well to this particular moment of expansion. So here why I'm wrong, right? And I want you to tell me more things about why that reading is wrong, which is, on the one hand, part of what you're doing is illuminating the continuities between older empires and this moment that for me would be the proto-moment of empire, let's say, right? That part of the way in which Europe conceives of itself as a unit is still in question, just to pick up on the previous question as well, that there's actually a sort of moment of uncertain consolidation happening here that my reading would miss, right? That would see this as the beginning of let's say, the lining up of cannons that are pointed outward, and I'd like to hear more corrections.
Thank you. This is a very important question, because we tend to think about the 16th century, about 16th century Europe, as the rise of nation states and nations. And this is, of course, also true, right? With the Treaty of Villers-Cotterêts in France, French becomes the only national or official language with François Ier. And we tend to forget that the larger unit in which those nation states are embedded is still not really defined. And this is precisely why I work on the larger on a larger scale, namely Europe. Where does Europe start and where does it begin? And it's a very tricky question because we have, of course, the discovery of the New World, but is it really, where are the boundaries if the new territory is part of Spain and Portugal and then France and England and so on and so forth? Is that an extension of Europe that spills over to the New World? Where is the boundary, or where in the Atlantic is the boundary? And actually the first kind of artificial boundary drawn between two countries in a kind of Ptolemaic manner is the line drawn in the middle of the Atlantic in 1494 with the Treaty of Tordesillas between Spain and Portugal, where you have in the Atlantic the distinction, okay, this part of the Atlantic belongs to the Portuguese and this belongs to the Spanish. So it's a very tricky question. It's again not a continental divide, it's a divide between two European countries. So the question, what is Europe, where does it start, even in the West, is very tricky, not to talk about the East, where we have a landmass, and most scholars would now agree that Europe, that defining Europe as Europe is actually perhaps wrong. It's really Eurasia, and there is nothing natural, nothing that lends itself for a continental divide, and those divides have been made in antiquity by just positing the Don River or the Tanais River as a continental boundary. That's the Greek geographers. But then we have the idea that that was taken up in the Middle Ages, that the three continents of the known world of the oikoumene were peopled by the three sons of Noah, and with the idea that Japheth populated Europe, so it has to be an entity. But when you look back to the Bible, there is no such passage. So it's again a kind of later medieval construction, first really proposed by Saint Jerome and Augustine, that there is such a thing like a continental divide. And humanists were really grappling in the 15th century and the 16th century with precisely that question. Where do we start? This is why I don't organize my project starting from specific nation states, how they're developed their empires, but I look really at the geography and how this larger unit called Europe was negotiated. I don't know whether that partially answers your question.
So why stop in 1580?
Well, basically, this is my last example is Camões and the Lusíads. So I kind of project into a little bit ahead, and I show that the Lusíads precisely is usually considered the first kind of global epic after the circumnavigation of Africa by Vasco da Gama, 1498. And I show that actually what happens is Luís de Camões still had the very Ptolemaic maps in mind, even with the Indian Ocean as an enclosed space when he was writing the poem. So they still are held true and are integrated in an epic that is usually considered, you know, a very kind of empire bound and global. So there is still this narrative and this imagery going on at the end of the 16th century.
Thank you for the talk. I'm interested in the ways in which your descriptions of the movement towards this kind of gridded spaces mirrors a sort of Heideggerian narrative about modernity, in which we move from sort of the living to the dead, right? From the living body to the dead body, from the unruly world to the tamed world, and so on and so forth. I wonder what happens. I mean, so on one hand, I think that's the standard story of modernity, right? And in some sense, the story that Heidegger tells, which is that people used to have an organic relation to their temples and their world, and now we have there's been a kind of second fall, if you want to think about it that way, in which our processes of abstraction have murdered the world away from us and frozen it or pinned it like a butterfly onto a flattened surface, right? I guess I want to know whether that story is necessary for the analysis that you're doing. To what extent, for instance, I mean, so Ptolemy was translated into Arabic in the 9th century. But, I mean, I know this is outside of your zone, right? But and that's outside of my zone too. But did it have a similar abstracting, deadening effect there, or not? So to what extent are the things you're describing the product of, it seems to me, forces that are not exactly operating on the same plane, let's say, or the same scale at which your evidence is operating?
Yeah. No, that's a terrific question, and yes, Arab maps are outside my comfort zone. But the interesting thing is that what I'm really interested in is to, and this narrative really also starts with Husserl and then is taken up by Heidegger and really determines a lot how we think about modernity in the 20th and also 21st century. What I'm interested in, and I wasn't able to go into detail in my talk, is how do these, I do think that there is this kind of transitional moment. However, I don't think it's a linear moment of transition from the living to the dead, from one spatial model to another. What I'm interested in is precisely what you were talking about, is the coexistence of different models. And this is exactly a period where we have medieval models, we have navigational charts, we have Ptolemy coexisting in one and the same author and in one and the same book. And this makes it so fascinating. So there are moments of resistance to this flattening. There are moments where we see, oh, it goes against the grain of what we think this book does. Geoffroy Tory's book seems to be a clear kind of Ptolemaic spatialization of the world, and yet we have the Christ-like figure embracing the world. So I'm interested in teasing out precisely those complexities and moments in which this kind of linear trajectory is disrupted and challenged. So I'm interested actually also in challenging precisely that narrative. I have to work with some theoretical models, and I find that model that is taken up by contemporary philosophers of cartography, such as Farinelli, incredibly helpful to think about texts that come from very different cultural, linguistic, and literary contexts and genres. So I have to have some sort of model to work with, and that model I find very convincing.
Just an observation, more than a question, or an observation in search of a question. I noticed both on this image that you give us here and an earlier image of Apollo that, I mean, it seems as if the cultural work is to find some surface on which we find the poetic inscribed. But if you look at, not that one, but the earlier one with the L, or with the I and the L. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. There we go. Yeah, just I think maybe one back. Right. There we go. Yeah, right. Okay. What I find interesting about both those images, right, and not just the common share of Apollo as the poetic, but they're both very traditional schemata, right? One is a list of the muses, the other is the 7 liberal arts. Right, so I wonder in some way if all this mapping is really not about old news, right? You know, about organizations of knowledge that we already have.
So this is an interesting topic, and it actually, I don't know whether I have the time to. I would like to show you perhaps another slide. Where is this? Oh, here. This is another talk here. So this is Durer's philosophy that shows precisely the 7 liberal arts, basically inscribed here, and it features philosophy just like in Boethius in the center of a woodcut. And this is, by the way, also part of Celtis's
Fortune.
Fortune?
Yeah, who sits on the throne.
Yeah, it's philosophy though, right? Yeah, it's philosophy. It's so it's inscribed here as philosophy. The interesting thing is that the philosophy starts now not with Plato. Plato is here. Here we have Cicero and Virgil. Here Albertus Magnus, the German medieval philosopher who wrote about space. But philosophy starts with Ptolemy. We have Ptolemy as the founding father of philosophy. So in a way, what is very interesting, yes, we have the 7 liberal arts, but they come in a different framework. And that framework is what I'm interested in. That framework is a spatial cartographic framework now with Ptolemy. Ptolemy becomes more important than Plato. And this is something that Panofsky, who analyzed that woodcut in Saturn and Melancholy, did not see. For them, this is just an old medieval image. But that's not the case. It does something. It does something entirely new. And this little element is exactly what I'm interested in. It proposes a new framework.
Great. Well, please join me in